Yeah, let's do it.
All right, sweet. So, welcome everyone back for another episode of Dragons and Astronauts. We are a science fiction fantasy podcast focused on building a community of science fiction and fantasy writers. If that's of any interest of you, feel free to subscribe to the channel here on YouTube. I'm your host, Sarah, and today I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest, Matt Charles, to the show. For those of you who don't know him, Matt Charles is an astrophysics graduate from Stanford University. He resides in Michigan and enjoys hiking, rock climbing, and writing fiction. His novel, To the Brink, is set in the near future and follows the journeys of a miner, a pilot, and an elite SEAL as they are thrust against the conflict of global tensions and climate change. Matt, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Hi, I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
I'm good, thanks. So to begin off, I like asking all the guests, when did you first fall in love with storytelling?
So yeah, that's that's very interesting thing that I've kind of reflected on this myself as I've grown as a writer in these past few years. And to tell the truth, for most of my life, I didn't really care much for writing, storytelling, anything of that nature. As my background in school might suggest, I was more into the math and science side of things, more of a STEM student, and I actually didn't really enjoy my literature classes. I would read. I've always been a reader, but I never really thought about writing, and I didn't really like writing. And then I think that as I grew older, I feel like there was this creativity underneath the surface, and as I moved away from science and academia as a field in general, I think that I did transition into wanting to express myself and wanting, having ideas in my head that I wanted to get out there. But at the same time, I think like many people who think about writing and people I've talked to myself, it's really hard to actually get them out and get that pen to paper or keys on the keyboard as is more likely today. So it's kind of a funny thing that ultimately led me to try writing. And what it actually was I read a book, a series of books that were so bad that I just felt if this is out there, then anybody, I could do better than this. And then I thought, well, why don't I? Right?
Right.
If I, it's like kind of put your money where your mouth is. If I really thought this is I could do better, then why not? And I think that it was a great moment and it kind of a good thing to come from a bad thing. I'm reading this book. I really didn't like it. It was actually the series was 18 books long. I'm not going to get into specifics, not going to name
Wow.
who the author was, but it started out decent and then the
Hmm.
last half, so that's like 9 books. I mean, they're not long books, but the quality of both the writing, the grammar, the story itself, the plot, the characters, it all really just got bad to the point where I don't think the last few books were even edited or read by anybody other than the author before going out there. It was just the whole thing was like, oh, it was so hard to get through. But I came out the other side thinking, wow, now I'm actually a lot more confident in my own abilities because I think I could do better than this, and people are reading these books, so perhaps people would read what I wrote.
Interesting. What was the genre of books that you read? Was it
It
like
was
a
science
so it
fiction.
was a science fiction? I kind of figured it would be with your background. You'd be like, oh, that's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So then when would you say you've like what year was it when you first started dabbling into writing? And is it the series we're talking about today or was it a different project?
Yeah, it was just 2 years ago, so very recent in the span of things. And again, I've been reading my whole life. I've especially, science fiction and fantasy both. Always have, I'd say I always have multiple books going on because there's the book I'm reading on my Kindle, there's the
Mm-hmm.
book I'm listening to on Audible, which is, I don't mix and match there. And then there could be a paperback book that I'm also reading on the side. Um, but it's again, so just 2 years ago, and that was To the Brink was the first book that I wrote, and I just was putting things together in a Google document, just kind of writing down some scenes. And in the beginning, I just thought, well, let me write one book. And you touched on another
Mm-hmm.
very crucial point for my writing was that with my background, as you said, I would read things and I just thought that's so wrong, and again, obviously science fiction has to bend the rules a bit. You're not going to get everything to be like completely scientifically accurate, but there's some things when it comes to just the way ships would fly in space, regardless of what technology there is. The base laws of physics, especially in science fiction. In fantasy, of course, you can kind of do whatever you want, but I
Right.
think science fiction should adhere to at least certain rules of reality. And so I really wanted to write something that was realistic, something that would stand up to some level of scientific scrutiny, and but at the same time would explore the future, and that's really what I tried to do into the Brink and the preceding books in that series, was come up with some story of how our world could evolve in the next few decades.
So I have a question for you on that because the books are set very, very close to now in the future. It's about 5, 6 years, I think, when the first events start taking place. When you were thinking about what would happen, what was your expectations when you were writing it? Was there anything you thought would have to be omitted, or any like technological advancements you had to consider when you are doing something like so close to modern day? Because when you're writing something that isn't 100 years from the future or 200 years from the future, but within the next decade, you almost have to deal with the uncanny valley a little bit. So how did you navigate that?
Right, yeah. One of the premises I tried to stick to is to use technologies and hardware and equipment that is either things that exist now that I anticipate would still exist in
Mm-hmm.
5 or 10 years, or look into what is happening in this field and kind of pull in concepts that are being explored right now but aren't in use. But
Mm-hmm.
I would expect, if the process continues there, that these are things we would see in the near future. And to add to that, I think there's definitely, the further out you get, the more leeway you have there, and that's something too. Again, with my specific stories, I tried to keep it as a more hard science fiction,
Mm-hmm.
so not getting too crazy with the level of technology.
Right.
But as the timeline progresses, I got to be more creative, and instead of having to rely on companies and what their products are now and what they're looking to do soon, I could jump to things that we don't actually have the science or research to back up as being possible, but we think they're theoretically possible.
Yeah, you point out something really good there for our audience, is that when you're writing more recent science fiction of like something that could happen in the near future, you have to go more hard sci-fi because there's a level of expectation there. And then the further out you go in the future, you can transition more into soft sci-fi. You can bend the rules a little bit because nobody knows what's going to happen and you don't have to rely quite on those conventions as much. So if there's a someone who could teleport in 2030, that would seem not nearly as realistic as 2300, for example. So getting back to the Brink a little bit, how is the writing process like in your first book? Did you read a lot of craft books? Did you figure it out on your own? Did you watch a lot of YouTube? What did that process look like for you?
Yeah, so I think ultimately my number one tool was just reading other books and just getting an understanding for what styles are out there, how people write, and I think kind of using a form of osmosis where I would just take in the books that I'd read and emulate different aspects of each of those. And in terms of really what the process looks like for me, in my books, I focus on specific scenes, particularly the action scenes. And when I have gone into each different book, I usually think through, because those are what I want to write the most, is I want
Mm-hmm.
to write these intense, gripping sequences where really puts the reader in the moment and is, well, it's action, and in a lot of cases it's violent, not necessarily, but many
Mm-hmm.
times it is. And I think those are the most exciting parts of the book. And so I start with that. And a lot of times I'll just think through scenes multiple times. I won't even write down specifics. It'll just be like a daydream playing through my mind as I'm out taking a walk or a hike. And once I've thought through it enough and I get some of the specifics down, then I'll start to write it. And this could be generally, I tend to write in order, but not necessarily. There's
Hmm.
times when I will jump ahead to a scene that's maybe multiple chapters in the future and then just kind of work back from there to make sure I fill in the gaps. But once I have these scenes down, then I go back and sort of bridge the gap with, I don't want to call it filler because it's all relevant items to the plot, to the characters, to the story, and to set things up. But there's definitely a difference in the pace of my writing where I can knock out thousands of words
Right.
of a very descriptive part, very easily, and then I kind of have to struggle to piece those together.
What was your solution to the writer's block that you felt when you had to connect your, big and exciting action sequences in your mind? How did you bridge the
Yeah,
puzzle pieces?
yeah, that was a tough one, and I definitely experienced times of that. I think part of it was really just stepping away, and I think one of the great things about for myself being self-published is that all the timelines are my own. I didn't have deadlines to work on, so getting the book out was really just a matter of when I wanted to do it. And in that case, like there were definitely periods where I would step away for weeks and not write a single word while a book was still in progress, where I just didn't feel like it. I just didn't really have the drive. And part of me always knew that I still wanted to get back to it and finish it. But I I think the first time it happened, it was maybe a shorter break, and
Yeah.
I kind of felt pressure like, oh, if I'm actually gonna this in the very first book, if I'm actually gonna finish this, I need to get back and do it. But after that, I realized that it would always be there. The documents are always there. The ideas are there in my head. And that sometimes it was fine to just take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even, and just not even touch it, maybe think about it a bit, but not feel forced to put in that effort. And then when I would return to it, I could flow back into those phases where I'm writing thousands of words a day and it balances out.
Yeah.
And I think another part there is something I've heard this before. I'm sure multiple authors have said it. I think maybe it was attributed to Stephen King of if you write 1 page a day, by the end of the year, you've got a 365-page book. And so there was a combination of that too, in that when I would go through times where I really didn't feel like writing, and I also didn't really have a direction on where to go, I would sit down and just try and write 1 page. And maybe it wasn't much. Maybe there wasn't a whole lot being conveyed. It didn't advance the story very much, but it was still words on the screen that progressed things. And so through a mix of that, of being able to trickle in and then being able to take breaks, it was counteracted by enabling me to go through periods of a week or two where I would just write, maybe half a book in a single week, which it averaged out to me
Yeah.
being able to finish, 7, 8 books or so in a couple of years.
Which is a really impressive pace if you think about it. Sometimes it takes people years and years to write one book. George R. R. Martin takes forever to write one
Oh
book.
yeah.
One of my favorite fantasy writers, Susan Dennard, takes like 4 years of book. So I started this series at the beginning of high school, and I'm still waiting to finish it. And I'm in
Oh
grad
yeah.
school now, and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. So how did you, to transition a little bit, how did you deal with the internal pressure to continue writing and stay encouraged? And then at what moment did you decide, you know what, I want to do something with this project and self-publish?
Yeah, another great question. I think to take on that first part, what it was, and in the beginning, as I said, I didn't exactly have the vision. I knew roughly that I wanted to put a story out there. I knew I wanted it to be this near future science fiction. Obviously, I knew I wanted there to be some type of conflict on Earth, something, with the climate, of course, taking things we're seeing now, something with space, obviously going to perhaps different planets, different solar systems. But I didn't think it would maybe even be more than a single book, just
Mm-hmm.
something out there. But once I really got into it, it was just the idea that I had these thoughts in my head and I had to get them out. That even if nobody was going to read the book, I had to have it written down for
Mm-hmm.
my own sake. And so that drove me on in the beginning. And then when I decided, all right, well, if I've done all this work to actually write a book, let's get it out there. Obviously, I want to share it with people. I want other people to read it. And outside of friends and family, obviously, those people got to read it before it was even published. But I think there's something, whether or not the book is going to be successful, it feels good just knowing it's out there.
Right.
And so to follow up with that in terms of the publishing process, in the beginning, I did start out looking at the traditional publishing route. And I think I ran into an issue that many people in my position have or will run into. And I would encourage anybody listening who is either thinking about publishing or looking into publishing to heed this story, so to speak, and that I initially thought that if I wrote what I thought was a good book, that somebody would take it and get it out there, and that that's just the way the market worked. And I think what you quickly find is that there are a lot more authors than there are publishing slots to put those books out. And I submitted a number of query letters. I don't recall how many, but most of them I didn't even hear back from. A
Yeah.
few of them I heard back, obviously negatively. But I think as is often the case, I find that there was a silver lining in it that turned out for the best because after I had submitted some query letters and I would read posts online, I would browse different forums trying to see, okay, what's the process here? Maybe there's a different approach to take. Maybe it's my query letters that are wrong. Maybe I'm just not finding the right agents out there. I realized that actually, if I were even to get taken on by a literary agent, I wouldn't like that process because it would take months to years even to get to publishing, and that there would be a whole lot of red tape involved in legal things, editing, all of this and that. The decision making, I think the thing that I realized ultimately too was after I wrote my book, I didn't want to change anything in it. Now,
Right.
I had it edited, of course. I had people read it. I wanted it to be coherent and make sense and not have glaring typos and errors in it. But I couldn't imagine that if I had this book picked up by some publishing house, that they could come back and tell me, hey, actually, we want you to rework this, or maybe even like delete this entire character. And I would have just not wanted that. And so I thought, well, if that's the case, then maybe I should just self-publish anyway. And there's obviously a trade-off because when you self-publish, everything's on you. Kindle and Amazon make it very easy to publish in that they handle a lot of the formatting and everything, and just getting it out there for distribution. But there's still this feeling that you're sort of tossing a glass of water out into the ocean. There's so many books out there that when it comes to self-published works, you'll never stand out. But I think for me, the biggest thing was I don't really mind that. I mean, I want to reach more readers and spread the story. And I think that the more my book gets read, the more inspiration it would give me to continue writing more books.
Sure.
But part of it is just knowing, hey, my book is out there, it's published. If I had somebody who wanted to read it, I wouldn't have to say, here, let me email you this PDF file. It could just be, hey, like, look on Kindle, here, you can download it, or here, you can order an actual physical paper copy in the store. And I
Hmm.
think that's just a great thing.
So would you say you were really when you're weighing the pros and cons, and there's pros and cons of both avenues. Like the creative freedom was one towards self-publishing that really drew you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Creative freedom
absolutely.
and also the timing that
Yeah.
from the moment I decided I wanted to publish it, you can self-publish something in a day. Once it's written, of course,
Yeah.
it's just a matter of uploading the files and that's that.
And how many books do you have published in the series now?
So within To the Brink, there are three books. And so that's the Future Frontline series. And that spans, there's To the Brink, To the Hilt is the sequel, and To the Stars is the third book. And that, I think just to touch on those quickly, because they change a lot. And I think To the Brink,
How
which
about you
is,
go ahead and pitch the first book for everyone while
yeah,
you're there?
so
Yeah.
To the Brink is it's a science fiction book. It's also definitely a military thriller where it has elements of conflict. One of the main characters is, as you mentioned, a Navy SEAL. So you have this inherent element of the war war going on. And what the book does is it takes it takes our near future again, where we're looking at a sort of a climate crisis of sorts, where the water is drying up in some places. Again, when I was writing this in 2022, it was the peak of the droughts
Hmm.
out in the West, and so there was definitely a strong influence there. But also working in a few other characters, and then a lot of it is based in the state of Michigan where I live. So there's a lot of just drawing on direct experience to write it. And what I try to do with this is to present a a somewhat crazy but foreseeable future, something where you could think, oh, this could actually happen, but then combine it with our future in space, where our countries, not just the United States, but the other superpowers, are moving into the realm of space, partially to mine asteroids, to try and get back to the moon, to have satellite infrastructure set up, where there's a lot more than just a single international space station, but much larger constructs, and a plan where we're really establishing permanent residences out in space that have strategic value to the people down on Earth. And so we have this greater geopolitical conflict, which takes place both on Earth and in space. And the other part of this is putting together the future of warfare. And one of the things that I want to impress upon people is that I I hope that the events in my book would never come true. I don't, try to celebrate war and fighting, but at the same time, I think it's an interesting thing to explore and understand what the ramifications of that would be, and also to see what a future war could be. A lot of the conflicts we have, as bad as they are, it's generally not two superpowers going head to head using every tool in their arsenal against each other. We have much more localized conflicts, and so I wanted to explore what could happen, what could the consequences be if we really did erupt into some broader conflict.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, we have a couple minutes left, but where can people find your book?
Yeah, so these books are on Amazon and on Kindle. If you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read them for free there with your Kindle Unlimited subscription. But they're also available as paperbacks on Amazon as well.
Uh,
And I would like to add, just kind of building off. So there's the main three
yeah.
books, but I do have a second series that is a series of novellas, so much shorter, about a third the length of the main books in the series, and they follow a specific character. That starts with the book Wheelman, and so it takes this one side character and just kind of builds off an entirely different story that involves fast cars and Detroit, and it's actually it's similar in that it's set in the future. It takes place in the same universe, the same
Hmm.
timeline, the same technologies, but it's just a much different pace. And so I would say anybody looking for maybe just a shorter read, those are again 20,000 words, something that you could easily get through in a single day.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Is there anywhere else people can follow you online or have updates about your work?
I appreciate the spreading it. Right now, I don't really have too much of an online presence. I think in my Amazon author page is the number one place to follow and understand when more works are coming out. But I would like to say anybody who reads or has read my work, I have my email there in the end. And I would appreciate all engagement if anybody ever has feedback they want to give or just wants to discuss some of the concepts that come up in the books, maybe questioning the reality of these things or trying to understand, hey, where did you come up with this idea? Is this something that could really happen? I'm always open for direct discussion.
Absolutely. And what email would it be so that people could reach out to you if they read it?
Yeah, that's mattcharlesbooks@gmail.com, all one word.
Perfect. And then before I let you go, what is your advice to people who want to write?
I think the most important thing is, and it's quite simple, is to just do it. And I know that that's one of these things where it's so much easier said than done, but I think the key is that if you really do start, the rest of it can flow. And I think another thing too, and I don't want to ramble on too long here,
No,
but
you're good.
just
You're
to
good.
add that something that helped me a lot was knowing that you don't have to have everything figured out before you start. In fact, I found that as I wrote, the story kind of wrote itself. That I would have general ideas I would go in with, but as I would progress, these bits of plot and scenes would just kind of build out of what I had written. And I had no idea that I was going to include it in the beginning, but as the more I write, the more it kind of gives you space to work off of. So I would say the most important thing is just think up in your head, what do you really want to write the most? Pick one scene, one character, just a few pages that you really have an idea for and you want, and just get that out there, and then it really can grow naturally from there.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Matt. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you as well. It was a pleasure being on. Great
Yeah,
talking to
of
you.
course. I hope you have a good rest of your night. Please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. You can follow us pretty much anywhere on social media, including YouTube, Spotify, and Instagram at Dragons and Astronauts. Finally, if you are an author of a science fiction or fantasy book, traditionally or self published, and would like to appear on the show, please have yourself or your agent email inquiries at askdragonsandastronauts@gmail.com. Thank you.